When Caitlin Clark went down with a quad injury, most fans thought the Indiana Fever would just have to tough out a few rough games. But what happened next wasn't just a bad night, it was a full-on system failure.
Indiana Fever lose to a young Washington Mystics team.
The Fever didn't just lose a game, they got exposed. And suddenly, everyone started asking the same question. Was this whole team built on a single player?
I'll say it. Fire Stephanie White.
2 days after Clark was sidelined, the Fever faced the Washington Mystics in what should have been a manageable matchup. But the result? A brutal 83-77 loss.
This was a absolute embarrassment.
And that score doesn't even begin to tell the story. No fast break points, over 17 turnovers. The offense fell apart. Without Clark, the Fever looked completely unrecognizable. But here's the thing, this collapse wasn't just about one game. It exposed something much deeper, a franchise trying to fast-track success, a coach under pressure, and a locker room that might not be as united as it seems. And it all started the moment Clark went down.
Like, they were embarrassingly bad without Caitlin Clark.
The first hints of disaster slipped in even before the opening tip. Clark's face was nowhere on the warm-up line, and the roar that had chased her across sold-out arenas for months flattened into uneasy chatter. CFG Bank Arena in Baltimore had been booked to cash in on her magnetism, but with the star in street clothes, whole rows were suddenly thin enough to see the stairs through them. The remaining diehards tried to will the Indiana Fever forward. What they got instead felt like a live demonstration of how fragile a fast-tracked franchise can be. The Mystics, a team still retooling after a brutal 2024, smelled blood. By the first media timeout, they had already forced 3 straight shot clock violations, shredding the Fever's high pick-and-roll sets that usually start in Clark's hands. What followed was 75 minutes of basketball that looked as if someone had yanked the power cord from Indiana's offense. Without Clark's warp speed outlet passes, the Fever produced exactly 0 fast break points. A stat so jarring the league's real-time tracker flashed it in red. The half-court sets were worse. Cutters mistimed by full steps, spacing cramped until post-prodigy. Aaliyah Boston found herself double-teamed before she even touched the ball. By halftime, she had logged more turnovers than touches in the restricted area, finishing the night with a season-low 10 points on 8 attempts. Meanwhile, Washington's Brittany Sykes slashed through screens like they were holograms, piling up 21 points and 9 boards. Rookie Kiki Iriafen added another 16 off quick duck-ins that punished every late rotation. Shakira Austin, fresh off the injury report, needed only 9 first-half minutes to drop 13 and make Indiana's rim protection look ornamental. When the smoke cleared, it was an 83-77 loss that somehow felt wider. Indiana coughed up the ball 17 times, shot 4 for 24 from deep, and posted an offensive rating that cratered nearly 20 points below their Clark-led average. The Washington Post Wikipedia, but the box score couldn't capture the psychological unraveling on the Fever bench. Head coach Stephanie White pacing tight semicircles, assistants flipping through laminated cheat sheets, searching for plays that didn't exist without their point guard prodigy. Cameras caught veterans Nalissa Smith and Kelsey Mitchell in a terse exchange after yet another mistimed flare screen. Moments later, Boston slammed her towel so hard it bounced onto the court. Every possession seemed to end with someone looking over a shoulder that used to see Clark waiting for the ball. Fans streamed toward the exits before the final horn, muttering that maybe all those instant contender think pieces had skipped a chapter called Growing Pains. Outside, a chilly rain pelted half-packed merchandise trucks, still stocked with Clark jerseys, a physical reminder that hype alone can't fill a scoring column. And the irony? The Fever's front office had insisted all week that Clark's absence was merely precautionary. Yet in 40 bruising minutes, the myth of plug-and-play greatness was ripped open for everyone to gawk at. As Brittany Sykes floated the last free throw to seal the margin, a handful of baffled Indiana players lingered at midcourt, staring at the scoreboard as if waiting for someone to reset it. No buzzer beater rescued them, no miracle run, just the slow, fluorescent flicker of reality setting in. If one strained quad could topple an entire blueprint, what else was hanging by a thread? But that unsettling question wouldn't stay rhetorical for long, because within 48 hours, whispers from inside the Fever locker room would burst into open accusations that made a box score meltdown look tame. And once those rumors hit the airwaves, the fallout would reach far beyond Indiana. The morning after the Fever's meltdown in Baltimore, sports radio was already foaming. But what really lit the match wasn't the loss. It was what insiders started hinting at behind the scenes. Whispers of tension, eye rolls in film sessions, veterans questioning rotations, and at the center of it all, the growing divide between Caitlin Clark and the rest of the locker room. To outsiders, the tension seemed impossible. Clark, after all, wasn't just any rookie. She was the rookie, a national sensation, #1 draft pick, and the biggest ratings magnet women's basketball had ever seen. But to some of her teammates, Clark's arrival wasn't just a spark, it was a spotlight that never moved. From day one, her name eclipsed every headline, her face dominated every billboard, and every minor move she made, good or bad, was dissected across every sports network in the country. The problem? That spotlight had to land somewhere else too. And it didn't take long before it began to cast long shadows over everyone else on the team. Veterans like Kelsey Mitchell and Nalissa Smith, who had been grinding for years before Clark ever touched a WNBA court, suddenly found themselves being referred to as supporting pieces. Local press stopped asking them questions after losses and instead waited for Clark to take the podium, even when she hadn't played well. One reporter even asked Mitchell directly if it felt like Caitlin's team now. Her response was tight-lipped. "We're all just trying to win." But that one sentence echoed online. Fans read between the lines. The subtext? The chemistry wasn't clicking. Behind closed doors, some teammates reportedly bristled at how quickly the franchise bent itself around Clark's star power. Practice schedules shifted to match her media obligations. Branding campaigns sidelined team veterans in favor of solo Clark photo shoots. Even team strategy, allegedly, was built more around marketing than merit. One league insider claimed that head coach Christy Sides had been pressured from above to keep Clark in the spotlight, even if it meant sidelining other players who were producing more consistently. By the time Clark sat out with her injury, the locker room had already reached a quiet breaking point. Sources close to the team described a relieved tension, as if players could finally breathe without the constant camera orbit. But even with Clark off the court, things didn't improve. In fact, they got messier. Rumors started to swirl that the loss wasn't just due to poor execution. It was the result of miscommunication, clashing egos, and even intentional on-court disconnects. One anonymous player reportedly told a local beat writer, "You can't build chemistry when the system is built for one person." The statement hit social media like a thunderclap. Analysts and fans immediately split into two camps: those defending Clark as the franchise savior, and those accusing her of disrupting a culture that had existed long before she arrived. The irony: Clark had never once publicly fed the drama. She continued to speak like a team-first leader in interviews, always deflecting praise and stressing growth. But in the modern media landscape, perception often matters more than intent, and perception was shifting. Headlines no longer asked, "Can Caitlin lead the Fever to the playoffs?" They asked, "Is Caitlin Clark already dividing her team?" What makes this so explosive isn't just the team chemistry, it's the timing. The WNBA is pushing its biggest marketing surge in decades, with Clark at the forefront. If her rise turns into a flashpoint for internal dysfunction, it won't just affect Indiana. It could ripple through the entire league, but what came next would make all this locker room noise feel small. Because just days after the loss, Caitlin Clark found herself in the center of a completely different firestorm. This time, not just involving her teammates, but nearly the entire league. And it started with one brutal foul that sent the internet into meltdown mode. It was supposed to be just another hard-fought game in a long season. But one play, just one, turned Caitlin Clark's rookie campaign into a national talking point, igniting debates that reached far beyond basketball. The moment came in a tight matchup against the Chicago Sky. Clark was curling off a screen near the baseline, looking to shake her defender and get free. But before she could even square up, boom! A shoulder check from Chennedy Carter sent her sprawling to the floor. No ball contact. No warning. Just a sharp, deliberate hip check that looked more like something out of a football drill than a basketball game. The arena gasped. Commentators fell into stunned silence. And social media? It exploded. Within minutes, hashtags like #ProtectClark and WNBA problem were trending across the US. The replay ran on a loop on ESPN, Bleacher Report, and every major sports outlet. Fans, analysts, and former players all weighed in, but their takes weren't unified. Some saw the hit as a clear cheap shot, an intentional act meant to humble the league's most hyped rookie. Others defended it, saying Clark had been playing with too much flair and too little respect, and that the league was simply welcoming her to the real WNBA. But that wasn't just a hard foul, it was a spark to a powder keg that had been building all season. Many league vets had already voiced frustrations about the media's obsessive focus on Clark. Despite barely being a few games into her career, she had already become the face of the WNBA. Endorsements, interviews, feature stories. Brands couldn't get enough of her. But while the hype was sky high, some players quietly resented the unspoken narrative that Clark was saving women's basketball, as if the league had been invisible until she arrived. To some, that idea wasn't just insulting, it was erasure. The Carter foul brought those feelings roaring to the surface. Instead of focusing on the game, post-match coverage spiraled into controversy. Even Clark, usually reserved in her comments, couldn't help but address it. In her post-game interview, she said calmly, "I'm just here to play. If that's how teams want to guard me, so be it." It was a poised answer, but her eyes told a different story. She knew the foul wasn't random, it was personal. Then came the league's response, or lack thereof. Despite fan outrage, the WNBA initially didn't call it a flagrant during the game. The officials let it slide, treating it like incidental contact. It was only after the footage blew up online that the league reclassified the foul as a flagrant one, but the damage had already been done. Critics blasted the WNBA for failing to protect its most marketable star. Others accused the league of trying to avoid the appearance of favoritism. Meanwhile, some veteran players doubled down, insisting Clark wasn't entitled to special treatment just because she had a bigger spotlight. But there was one major problem with that logic. Clark wasn't asking for special treatment, she was asking for fair treatment. And fans saw the difference. By midweek, an open letter had gone viral demanding league officials crack down on targeted physicality. Even NBA stars like LeBron James and Kevin Durant chimed in, with LeBron calling the foul unacceptable and KD tweeting that if that happened to a rookie in the NBA, the whole league would be on fire right now. Suddenly, this wasn't just about basketball, it was about culture, power dynamics, and how the league treats its most visible players. Clark was no longer just a player, she had become a symbol, a lightning rod for bigger conversations that had been bubbling beneath the surface for years, and perhaps most fascinating of all, Clark never retaliated. No flopping, no trash talk, no flagrant revenge. She just got up, tightened her ponytail, and got back on defense. The next play, she dropped a 3 in transition, but the next chapter in this saga wouldn't be about a single shot. It would be about the growing rift between two realities, the one Clark was living and the one the rest of the league believed she didn't understand. And that divide, it was about to go public. in the ugliest way yet. As the dust settled from the Chennedy Carter incident, it became clear that this wasn't just about a foul, or even just about Caitlin Clark. The hit had opened a fault line that had been quietly growing between the WNBA's new era and its old guard. What followed wasn't just drama, it was a culture clash, and one the league could no longer keep behind closed doors. It started with passive-aggressive comments in press conferences. Then it moved to cryptic social media posts. Some veteran players began liking tweets that accused the media of Caitlyn favoritism or implied that Clark hadn't earned her shine. Others reposted clips of lesser-known WNBA stars doing highlight reel moves with captions like, "Put respect on her name." On the surface, these posts seemed harmless, but the subtext was obvious. Clark's spotlight wasn't just unearned, it was taking up everyone else's oxygen. Suddenly, the conversations around Clark had less to do with basketball and more to do with identity, respect, and resentment. There were debates about race, some pointing out that previous black stars didn't receive nearly the same level of marketing support or corporate endorsements, despite putting up historic numbers. There were whispers about how Clark's clean-cut, all-American image made her more palatable to mainstream brands, while louder, flashier, more outspoken players were often labeled difficult. And while Clark herself never fed that narrative, she couldn't stop it either. Because no matter how humble she acted, no matter how many assists she dropped or how many post-game questions she redirected to her teammates, her face was still the one being used to sell the league. Her jersey was the top seller. Her highlights were the most viewed. Her name was the one that got casual fans to finally tune in. It put Clark in an impossible position. Damned if she embraced the attention, and damned if she rejected it. She was being accused of arrogance in one breath, and passivity in the next. Meanwhile, the league itself was caught in the middle, trying to promote its biggest draw without alienating the players who had carried it through decades of underfunding, minimal exposure, and second-class treatment. But this divide didn't just play out in interviews or social media subtweets. It began to show up on the court. Opposing players started playing her more physically, shoulder bumps away from the ball, hand checks that lingered a little too long, post-game handshakes avoided altogether. During one particularly heated matchup, cameras caught a brief exchange between Clark and a rival guard where neither cracked a smile. No words were shared, just a hard stare, and then a cold walk to opposite benches. The tension became so obvious that even neutral broadcasters had to acknowledge it on air. During one national broadcast, the analyst paused mid-commentary and said, "You can feel it. There's something personal going on out there." And they were right. This wasn't just competition anymore. It was personal. It was layered, and it was starting to infect every part of the season. But perhaps the most telling moment came when Clark was asked directly about the growing friction. In her trademark calm, she said, "I have so much respect for everyone in this league. I'm just trying to earn mine." But her expression was tired. Not defensive, not angry, just tired. Like someone who'd been fighting a battle she never signed up for. And maybe that's the heart of the whole thing. Clark didn't ask to be the face of the league. She didn't design the ESPN specials or beg Nike for a signature shoe. She just played her game. But in doing that, she unintentionally became a symbol. And symbols attract pressure. Symbols attract backlash, and sometimes symbols get caught in battles that were already raging long before they arrived. Yet this divide isn't just a Clark problem, it's a WNBA problem. One the league must address head-on if it wants to survive its moment in the spotlight without tearing itself apart. Because behind every welcome to the league bump and every viral foul, there's a deeper message. Some players feel unseen. And Clark's rise, fair or not, is forcing those feelings to the surface. But if the culture war wasn't enough, the Fever were about to find themselves facing a new kind of pressure, one with much higher stakes. Because while the locker room simmered and the league debated, Indiana's front office was preparing for a decision that could change everything. and Clark's future in the WNBA might hang in the balance. The rumors began as low backstage chatter, the kind you could dismiss as post-loss venting. But by sunrise the next Monday, IndianaFever.com had quietly stripped head coach Christy Sides' bio from its staff page. 2 hours later, the Woj bomb landed. Fever part ways with Sides after 29 games. ESPN.com. A franchise that trumpeted stability in May had yanked its strategist before Halloween, leaving Clark's rookie campaign without the person who drilled every practice rep. Insiders insisted it wasn't just about the losses, it was optics, locker room static, and whisper it, marketing math. Because in the front office's spreadsheets, Clark wasn't merely a player, she was a billion-dollar swing. Literally. Economists pegged her 2025 league-wide impact near 11 figures, with Indiana's valuation leaping from $90 million to $340 million the moment she signed. New York Post. So the calculus was brutal. If the on-court product dragged, the growth curve flattened. Sides became the first sacrifice. ESPN analyst L. Duncan called the firing a panic move that could stunt the Fever's entire rebuild, likening it to pulling up a sapling because it hasn't fruited after one season. Yet inside Gainbridge Fieldhouse, the mood wasn't reflective, it was frantic. Clark's quad was still tender. Sydney Colson, the veteran backup promised as ballast, had rolled her ankle the night after the DC debacle. Fans on X dubbed the situation point guard apocalypse, hammering the front office to sign somebody, anybody who can breathe the ball up court. Essentially, sports GM Lynn Dunn's phone lit up with trade feelers before lunch. Dallas dangled third-year distributor Veronica Burton. Chicago hinted at prying Dana Evans loose for a future first. Every deal came with cap gymnastics, because the Fever's books were already stress-tested by endorsement-adjacent incentives written into Clark's rookie pact. A patchwork of appearance clauses that let her film Nike content on off days and log miles most vets never see. Her base salary remained a paltry $76,000, but the off-court empire, topped by a $28 million swoosh deal, made her both bargain and behemoth. Yahoo Sports. Inside the locker room, the coaching void felt even stranger than the player shortage. Practices were run by interim assistant Carlos Knox, a defensive specialist suddenly scripting crunch time ATOs for the league's most scrutinized rookie. One source said the vibe was summer camp counselor energy. Everybody's polite, nobody's sure who actually has authority. Meanwhile, Clark's rehab dragged into its second week, and each day out of uniform cost the Fever roughly $350,000 in projected gate and merch, according to internal estimates. That math, more than any angry tweet, drove Dunn to the brink of a blockbuster, packaging Nalissa Smith and a protected first to Phoenix for All-Star floor general Skylar Diggins-Smith. Reporters caught wind within hours, and social feeds detonated again. Trade the future to save the present? Debate raged over whether mortgaging draft capital for a 34-year-old guard made any sense. Some argued a Diggins-Smith rental could steady the ship, give Clark a veteran mentor, and keep turnstiles spinning. Others blasted it as desperation, proof the front office cared more about quarterly revenue spikes than long-term rings. Through it all, Clark kept the corporate smile fixed. She posed for a shoe launch billboard in downtown Indy, then iced her leg in the training room while executives huddled upstairs. One teammate overheard her murmur, "I just wanna hoop." But beneath that calm sentence was a new reality. Her star power had reshaped every layer of the organization, from roster math to marketing budgets, and with a coach gone and a mega trade looming, the Fever were gambling that the same spotlight fracturing their chemistry could also bake the cracks shut, if they moved fast enough. Whether that bet pays off or detonates the rebuild for good will hinge on one high-stakes front office handshake slated for the league's trade deadline, now just 6 days away. And if you thought one firing was messy, wait until you see what happens when a deal built on hype collides with a hard cap. Because the next chapter won't just decide Indiana's season, it could rewrite the WNBA's entire balance of power. By now, it was obvious. Caitlin Clark's arrival hadn't just shifted the Indiana Fever's dynamics, it had reshaped the WNBA itself. Ratings were up, arenas were packed, and merch was flying off shelves. But beneath the surface of this unprecedented boom, something darker was simmering. A deep identity crisis inside the league. One that no commissioner, coach, or player could ignore much longer. The WNBA had spent years, decades fighting for visibility, fighting for respect. And just when it finally started to break through into mainstream consciousness, the conversation had narrowed around one person. Clark's meteoric rise had brought in millions of new fans, many of whom had never watched a WNBA game before she entered the league. From a business standpoint, it was a dream scenario, but for the veterans who had spent years grinding in packed summer gyms, often for minimum contracts and zero national airtime, it felt like something else. Erasure. The message wasn't being delivered through words, it was being broadcast through algorithms. Networks only aired Fever games in primetime. ESPN segments spent 80% of WNBA coverage breaking down Clark's shooting percentages, and almost none on MVP frontrunners like Aja Wilson or Breanna Stewart. Even Google searches for WNBA now auto-completed to Caitlin Clark stats. It was as if the rest of the league had become background noise to her solo act. But here's the twist. Even Clark herself didn't seem to want that role. She wasn't a villain. She wasn't arrogant. In interviews, she constantly praised her peers, deflected attention, and spoke like someone painfully aware of how outsized the spotlight had become. But it didn't matter. The momentum had already outgrown her intentions. She wasn't asking to be the WNBA's savior. She had been made into one. And that manufactured pedestal? It was getting wobbly. You could see the tension boiling over in subtle ways. Player introductions in certain arenas were met with louder cheers for Clark than for the home team's All-Stars. Fans who had never watched a WNBA game were now live tweeting about how dirty the league was for targeting Caitlin. Longtime players felt underappreciated. Newcomers felt misunderstood. And the league, scrambling to capitalize on the explosion, made moves that only widened the divide. Take the promotional campaigns. The next era, the face of the league. She changed everything. The problem wasn't the praise. It was the implication that nothing meaningful had come before her. That women's basketball had been waiting for Clark like a prophecy. It didn't matter how respectful Clark herself was. That narrative cut deep for players who had spent years carrying the sport without a fraction of her spotlight. Then came the sponsorship gap. Clark inked multi-million-dollar deals with Nike, Gatorade, and State Farm before her rookie year had even ended. Some of her veteran teammates, meanwhile, still relied on overseas gigs in the offseason just to make ends meet. The economic disparity within the same locker room created a quiet, growing friction, one that no team-building seminar could fix. And it wasn't just a Fever issue anymore, it was league-wide. Matchups involving Clark often led to beefs, hard fouls, stare-downs, and more those moments were being clipped and shared not as basketball highlights, but as culture war fodder. Fans weren't just cheering teams, they were picking sides. Was Clark being unfairly targeted, or was she being protected while the rest of the league got ignored? Even the WNBA commissioner Kathy Engelbert found herself in the crosshairs. When asked whether the league was overly invested in one player, she said, "We want to grow the game, and Caitlin is helping us do that." It was a diplomatic answer, but to some players, it confirmed what they already feared. The league didn't just want Clark's talent, they wanted her image, her brand, her spotlight. And that meant everyone else was competing in a game they hadn't signed up for. The uncomfortable truth? The WNBA needed Caitlin Clark, but it also needed to protect its culture, its players, and the legacy that had built this league long before she arrived. Balancing that equation wasn't just a PR challenge, it was an existential one. Because if the tension kept building, if resentment kept bleeding into the game, the league's golden era could fracture before it ever truly began. And as the playoffs crept closer and the Fever clawed their way toward the 8th seed, one thing became painfully clear. Clark's rookie season had become something bigger than basketball. It was now a referendum on fame, on fairness, and on whether a league built on unity could survive the weight of its own spotlight. But just when it seemed like things couldn't get more chaotic, a new controversy exploded, one that didn't involve fouls or front office firings. It came from the most unexpected place, a leaked video that no one saw coming, and that would change how fans saw Caitlin Clark forever. It started with a blurry screen recording, 35 seconds, posted anonymously to a burner account with less than 100 followers. At first it looked like nothing, just some locker room chatter caught on someone's phone. But as the audio got clearer and the subtitles started rolling, one voice stood out unmistakably. Calm, clipped, unmistakably Midwest. It was Caitlin Clark. In the clip, she wasn't ranting, she wasn't trashing teammates, but the conversation, part of a private moment that was never meant to be public, hit like a grenade. Clark was sitting with a trainer and another teammate, her left leg elevated in what looked like an ice wrap. She was talking quietly about the team's recent struggles, clearly frustrated. Then came the sentence that no one could unhear. It's hard to lead when they act like I haven't earned being here. That was it. One sentence, not shouted, not hateful, just honest, too honest. The backlash was immediate. Within an hour, the video had been reposted to X, TikTok, Instagram, and Reddit. Headlines followed. Caitlin Clark calls out teammates. Tension explodes inside Fever locker room. Thousands of fans flooded comment sections, some defending her right to speak candidly about the pressure she was under, others accusing her of undermining team unity and throwing her peers under the bus. The Fever organization issued a quick, tightly worded statement. This video was recorded without consent and reflects a private moment between teammates. We stand by Caitlin and are addressing the issue internally, but the damage was already done. What the public now had was undeniable proof that the tension everyone had suspected inside the locker room wasn't just real. It was boiling. Veterans across the league reacted with mixed emotion. Some, like Chiny Ogwumike, took to ESPN and offered cautious empathy. She's under a microscope unlike anything we've seen, but you still have to protect the circle. Others were more blunt. Aja Wilson reposted the clip with a caption that read simply, "Y'all still think this ain't personal?" Even Clark's biggest defenders found it hard to spin, because while the tone of the clip wasn't vicious, the content painted a revealing picture. Clark felt like an outsider inside her own team. She felt like she was being iced out. And whether or not she was right, she just said the quiet part out loud, on tape. But it wasn't just the quote that stung, it was what followed. Just a few seconds later in the clip, the unnamed teammate seated beside her responds, "You know what they think. You didn't grind like they did. You skipped the line." That phrase, "skipped the line," wasn't new. It had been floating around online since Clark's first month in the league, whispered in podcasts, hinted at in Reddit threads, murmured by fans who felt the game's new golden girl hadn't paid the same dues. But now it was right there, spoken inside the Fever's own locker room, out loud, on record. The implications were massive. For one, it shattered the league's carefully cultivated narrative of unity. For another, it exposed just how deep the cultural rift ran, not just around Clark, but around what she represented: media privilege, corporate favoritism, the age-old debate of legacy versus lightning in a bottle hype. And then came the fallout. The Fever canceled a post-game media session the following night without explanation. Clark's teammates refused to speak to reporters. Coach Carlos Knox opened practice the next day with a quote from Michelle Obama about rising above division, a moment that felt more like damage control than inspiration. Meanwhile, social media remained in full-on battle mode. Hashtags trended, #Team Clark versus Earned, not given. Journalists dug through old college interviews, looking for signs of ego or entitlement. Clark's former Iowa teammates were even dragged into the spotlight, forced to comment on the real Caitlin behind the scenes. And Caitlin, she stayed quiet for 4 days. When she finally broke her silence, it wasn't through a press conference. It was a short, emotionally measured Instagram video. Her sitting alone, no makeup, no production. I said something in frustration that wasn't meant for anyone's ears but my own. That doesn't make it okay. I respect my teammates, I'm learning and I'm listening, but I'm human. And I care. Some praised the accountability, others called it scripted damage control. Either way, it only deepened the divide. Because by now, it wasn't just about whether Caitlin Clark could shoot or lead or carry a franchise. It was about whether the WNBA could survive having its most polarizing player also be its most essential. But with playoffs fast approaching and the fever clinging to the final seed, there wasn't time for soul searching. The team had a choice: implode or lock in. And in the final weeks of the season, what happened next would stun everyone, including Caitlin herself. Because the pressure she'd been under, it was about to become something else entirely. Something much, much bigger. When Caitlin Clark first stepped onto a day court, the expectations were already astronomical. Fans wanted magic. Broadcasters wanted storylines. Brands wanted a hero. What no one seemed to ask was whether a 22-year-old rookie, no matter how talented, could carry the weight of an entire league's evolution on her back. By season's end, that pressure had shaped everything: the locker room dynamics, the front office decisions, even the tone of conversations in living rooms and group chats across the country. Clark wasn't just a basketball player anymore. She was a mirror, reflecting back the ambitions, tensions, and unspoken truths that had always existed inside the WNBA, but had never been forced to the surface this fast, this publicly. The team, it pulled through. Barely. The Fever scraped into the playoffs with a 15-25 record, thanks to a late-season rally fueled not by flash, but by grit. Clark adjusted. She passed more. She stopped trying to save games alone. And her teammates, they met her halfway. There were no miracle runs, no championship parades, just hard-earned wins and a silent understanding that growth, real growth, takes time. But for the WNBA, the stakes were bigger than any scoreboard. The league now faces a new reality. Its future audience is watching for Clark, but staying will depend on how the league tells everyone's story, not just hers. The money, the media, the marketing machine, they all orbit Clark now. But if the league lets that orbit become a black hole, where no other stars can shine, it risks losing the very soul that made women's basketball special in the first place. And for Clark, she leaves her rookie season not just as a sensation, but as something rarer, a symbol tested, booed in rival arenas, targeted on defense, dragged online, celebrated by millions, and still standing. No matter what side of the debate you're on, one thing is undeniable. She didn't just change the league's ratings, she changed its reflection. Because this wasn't just about one player or one team or even one season. This was about what happens when the spotlight lands too hard, too fast, and whether the game is strong enough to grow in its glare. And in the WNBA's most chaotic, conflicted, and unforgettable season yet, one truth rose above the noise. Caitlin Clark didn't break the league. She revealed it.